Okay, very good evening to everybody here again, and to those who have just come in since I spoke last. Um, I'll get started with our introduction so that we'll have enough time for the conversation that we'll get into. So a very good evening, warm welcome to everybody. Thanks very much for joining us here at the Economic Research Council. It's a pleasure to have you as always. We're really delighted to have Professor Tim Jackson here with us for what I really truly believe is going to be an exciting and very interesting conversation discussing how we reimagine our economy around health, around care, sorry, rather than growth. Um, Tim's the author of the recently published book, The Care Economy. He is also a professor of sustainable development at the University of Surrey. Um, his groundbreaking book, Prosperity Without Growth, was named the Financial Times Book of the Year in 2010, whilst his second book, Post-Growth: Life After Capitalism, won the prestigious Eric Zenzi Prize in Ecological Economics in 2022. His latest book, which we'll talk about today, is called The Care Economy, published recently this year, and completes this trilogy arguing that prosperity means health rather than wealth, and that care rather than growth should organize economic life. Beyond his academic work, he's an award-winning BBC dramatist, and I think this combination of economic rigor and narrative skill makes his work really intellectually substantial and quite accessible as well. So the format of today will be more of an in-conversation style event. I'll talk to Tim and we'll discuss the arguments presented in his book for roughly 30 minutes, maybe a little bit longer. We'll see how things go. Then we'll open up the floor to Q&As, where we really do encourage you to participate. As we're going along through the event, sorry, please do submit any questions that you have using the Q&A function, and we'll do our best to address as many of them as we can. Okay, so with great anticipation then, I think we should start our discussion really. And I guess the first thing that I thought might be useful to do, Tim, would be if you wouldn't mind just kind of providing our audience with a kind of high-level introduction to the book.
Yes, of course. And first of all, thanks, David. Thanks for inviting me. As you say, I'm not sure the trilogy's finished, to be honest. I think there's always there's always something still to write, something still to think about, and and actually, I'm sort of starting to think about that already. But the care economy is definitely a sort of distillation of arguments that started when I was writing Prosperity Without Growth, and when I was writing Prosperity Without Growth, one of the questions is, what can prosperity possibly mean on a finite planet, and how should we define it? And of course, in economics and in political life as well, we tend to define prosperity just in monetary or financial terms. But actually, its meaning is much broader than that. If you go back to the roots of the word itself, prosperes, in accordance with our hopes and expectations, that gives you more of a sense of a much broader thing of how is my life going? Is it going as I would wish it to go? And when you ask people those kinds of questions about prosperity, one of the things that comes out first and foremost, and I had begun writing about this in Prosperity Without Growth, is this idea that prosperity is better conceived as health than as wealth, or at least first and foremost. And there's lots of, lovely quotes. There is no wealth without health, or health is the first wealth. And you can find these equations actually of prosperity as health rather than wealth in the poets of old, in the wisdom of the sages, in ordinary people when you ask them on the street what matters to them. And so this idea, that's proposition one really of the care economy, that prosperity is better conceived as health than as wealth. And in that case, what's really interesting is that you open up a very different dynamic. If prosperity is about wealth, then the dynamic is really about accumulation. The more and more you have of it, the better and better off you are, and the greater your prosperity. But if your prosperity is about health, health has a very different dynamic. There's very little actually in health which gets better just by accumulating or just by growing. So growth is no longer the primary metaphor when you start thinking about prosperity in terms of health. And rather, the metaphor that you end up with is something around balance. And the force that brings us back into balance is what I'm in the book calling care. And so prosperity better thought of as health and as wealth. The economy should be focusing more on care, this process of bringing us back into balance, than on growth. And that, in a nutshell, is the it sounds very simple, almost too simple when you put it in those terms. And of course, in some sense, the question of the book is not that simple proposition, but rather when that makes so much sense, why isn't it happening? And I spend a lot of time in the book addressing that question.
Okay, interesting. Looking at that kind of focus on care, then, if you like, and I know you mentioned that the trilogy is not yet finished, but over the period of that time that you've been writing these books, how much of that focus on care was there originally when you were looking at that first book, and how much have your ideas kind of been molded over time since then?
Yeah, it was actually when I look back, it was there because in Prosperity Without Grace, I began to ask the question, if growth for its own sake is not really the end of the economy, then what is it that we want within the economy? Obviously, we need enough food, we need proper housing, we need good shelter, we need safe water supplies. And then beyond that, we need clothing, not just to keep ourselves warm, but also for status and differentiation and affiliation. A lot of symbolic tasks that the consumer economy fulfills for us. But if our resources are finite, if we take seriously the idea that resources themselves are limited, beyond that point where we've satisfied our material needs, actually a lot of consumption is dedicated to our relational needs, to our belonging to a group, our sense of identity, our sense of meaning and purpose, the ability to live a meaningful life. And these needs, what's interesting about these needs is that they're not just supplied or not just efficiently supplied just from having more and more stuff. They're actually, in some sense, undermined by that idea of consumerism because consumerism always wants to keep us unsatisfied so that we always want to have more. And that's what keeps that growth-based economy going. But actually, as soon as you try and reframe it, as I was trying to do right back in Prosperity Without Growth, you start asking, well, which sectors of the economy matter? And they revolve actually, and I called it at the time the Cinderella economy, an economy which is about care, creativity, craft, connection, because these are the things that matter to us once our material needs are satisfied. And yet, those bits of the economy, this Cinderella economy, and the reason that I called it that is because they are left behind in capitalism. They're not things that are prized in capitalism. So the roots of the idea were there for sure, back in Prosperity Without Growth. What the care economy does is it takes those two threads forward and then it begins to tease out and to flesh out what that really means in practice. And also, as I say, why it doesn't happen in practice.
Mhm. And I think the book feels quite personal at times. I don't know if you would mind talking about how some of your experiences might have guided your thinking within the book.
Yeah,
Possible.
it's written in a very different style from Prosperity Without Growth. And Prosperity Without Growth started its life as a report to the UK government back in 2009. So it was written as a government report, and it was, marshalling the arguments, presenting the data, looking at how much you could think about decoupling economic growth from material impact. There was a lot of what you could call policy depth in that report. And one of the interesting experiences for me was that the audience of that report, formally it was a report to the UK Prime Minister when it first came out. The audience for that report was not particularly receptive, let's say, but it did have an enormous broader impact on quite a wide and unexpected audience. And that was the point at which I began to realize that you can make the arguments in a scientific and technical and economic sense as tightly as you might want to make them. But if you can't bring people along with you, that's never going to change the way in which our leadership represents the interests of their constituents and turns it into policy. And so in Post Growth, the second book you mentioned, I began already to write in a slightly different way. And by the time I got to the care economy, I wanted to write something which was not just for economists. I wanted to write something which was accessible to people who felt as though economics itself was inaccessible. And so that was very much a part of the personal journey that you mentioned. And then there was another part of the personal journey, which is really about my own health, because halfway through writing the book, I was diagnosed with diabetes. Now, diabetes is one of a number of chronic non-communicable diseases that is reaching epidemic proportions in our population. And so when I began to think about, writing my own health journey into this book, it's not me that matters. It's not one statistical point that matters. It's actually that I had, without realizing it, become a kind of a minor player in a massive pandemic of chronic disease, which we are simply not dealing with, and we're actually undermining, in part because we're too rigorously following the growth-based paradigm and paying too little attention to health in society and to population health. And I can talk about that in more detail if you want to get into that. But those two personal aspects, I suppose, were the main things that I brought into the care economy that hadn't been there before.
Yeah, okay, interesting. Thank you. Okay, looking kind of more at the crux of the book and the things that contain within it, I think one of the kind of key claims within it really is that, as you've mentioned already, the wealth is kind of adversarial to health, really, and that's quite different from saying that we need to balance growth and well-being. And I just wonder, kind of, why you believe that they can't coexist, really? Why the adversarial nature exists?
Yeah. I'm not sure, David, that they can't coexist, but I think
Yeah.
what is really difficult is when you prioritize growth, when you privilege growth, when growth becomes the most dominant policy metric and the most important foundation for your economic understanding. Because let me just give you an example, and it goes back to what we were talking about before, chronic disease. Now, much of chronic disease is related to lifestyle, our lifestyles, the way that we live, the kind of life that we have. And a lot of that is actually dictated by the kind of society that we live in. And the kind of society we live in is dictated by our affiliation, our obsession, our almost a fetish with growth itself. And so, for instance, and that plays out in things that really matter. So, again, to give you a concrete example, a lot of chronic disease is attributable to diet. And diet in the UK and in many Western economies and increasingly across the world is being dominated by foods which are actually inimical to health. And yet we support those industries who are producing those foods because they contribute growth to the economy. And actually, you can go, time and time again, you see some of these industries going into the Houses of Parliament, going into government, lobbying their case, and governments saying, yes, we like this industry because it contributes to growth in the economy. And so we're going to support it. We're not going to regulate it. We're not going to even look at the data, which is telling us that these same industries are causing an epidemic of chronic disease. We're just going to turn a blind eye to that. And yet the costs of that are enormous. I did a report for the Food, Farming and Countryside Commission after the book was published, actually, working out the costs in the UK and the cost of trying to manage and unsuccessfully trying to manage this epidemic of chronic disease is 4 times what it would cost us to allow every household in the country access to healthy food. And so it's actually uneconomic. It's a false economy that we're creating. We're creating it because we are privileging the growth of these industries, which are causing all the harms, and yet we're then having to suck up the costs of population health, which is declining rapidly, of diabetes, of heart disease, of strokes, of cancers, of musculoskeletal diseases, many of which are exacerbated and some of which are directly caused by the food system that we are privileging because it contributes growth. And if that weren't enough, there's another, then how do we treat those diseases? Well, largely with pharmaceutical interventions. And the pharmaceutical companies go do the same thing. They go to government and say, you need this industry because it contributes to growth. And the Prime Minister, turns up and announces that Britain is open for business on the stage with Eli Lilly, a huge pharmaceutical company. In a sense, because this particular government at this particular time, like many other governments, is absolutely about growth, growth, growth. And they say it time and time again. And yet, these two industries, both of which are contributing to growth, food, on the other hand, big food in particular, and pharmaceutical industry, are responsible for and failing to address the underlying causes of this epidemic of chronic disease. If we focus on growth, we miss health. And so really the call is, we don't, it's not about neglecting growth, not or about neglecting the places where growth could actually help us, but it's saying, listen, the core of our prosperity is health. And we are neglecting that because we are over privileging this idea of growth at all costs.
Okay, interesting. I think I've got two kind of comments from that, slightly different, so bear with me. The first is kind of, do you think that a big part of this problem then is about what we choose to measure, and maybe more importantly, what we choose to report on in terms of the data that we have access to, that kind of makes us focus on growth because it's always something that's highlighted. You always see the bulletins on the news, so on and so forth. Or it probably is wider than that, but does that play a part in it? And I guess the second, which is slightly different, is the research that you did for the Food and Farming and Countryside Commission. I was going to ask what shocked you in the work that you did with them. The statistic that you provided there was quite stark, to be fair. And I just wondered if there's anything else that you found out from that.
Sure. Yeah. So yes is the answer to the first question. What we measure matters. And if we, particularly when, I mean, the GDP is a really interesting measure. It's a very complex measure of how an economy works. It can tell you a lot about the working of the economy. It can tell you, it's the way, I don't know if you know or the audience knows how it's constructed, but for my mind, it's a very clever measure. It measures what we spend, it measures what we earn, it measures the value we create in the economy, and all those three different ways of looking at the GDP line up with each other in this very sophisticated understanding of how the economy works. And that allows us to say, for example, how much we should invest for tomorrow, how much we should spend in taxes, how much the government can afford to do. It tells us a lot about the balance between the private sector and the public sector. It's a very sensible measure if you're trying to understand how the economy is working. But it is not, and it was never intended to be a measure of prosperity. But because we could measure it, and because we'd set up this sophisticated measurement program and this framework, really, and because it became a sort of scoreboard, a way of measuring our progress against each other, against other countries, against last year, it's gradually emerged into this sort of, political target which governments continually prioritize and continually aim for. I mean, you don't really need any more evidence than how the last few governments in this country have talked about growth, because they all talk about it in the same way as a kind of holy grail. This is it. This is where we're going. This is the direction of travel. This is how we have to prove ourselves as better than the last government. And yet it was never really intended as that. So, if you're just measuring that, if you're just measuring your performance against that, if you're just using that as the target of your policy and of your policy directions, then you're just gonna miss so many things that matter. So yes, measurement is part of it. And the extent of that, I mean, to get to your second question, one of the things that was really shocking from the point of view of that Food Farming and Countryside Commission is that this cost of this public health disaster, just looking at the bit that's attributable to the fact that we have a dysfunctional food system that we could easily fix, the costs of that were 268 billion pounds every year in the UK, and that's bigger than the budget for the NHS. It's a huge proportion of the government's spending, and it's simply becoming unpayable. And we're not even in the process, we're not even beginning to diminish the prevalence of chronic disease in the population. We're just trying to manage the impacts of it year on year. And so it's a, that to me is what I suppose I found shocking is that this is a deeply economic argument. It's an economic argument that Treasury ought to understand. Treasury is desperately this week trying to find, 30 billion pounds or something. We are frittering away almost 10 times that because
Yeah.
we are failing to address this dysfunctional food system and its outcome, which is a massive population health disaster.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Moving things slightly forward a little bit to some other bits that you mentioned in your book. I think our audience will be well aware of the concept of the invisible hand, and you kind of build your framework around the concept of the invisible heart. Would you mind kind of talking to us a little bit about what you mean by that, about where that's come from and how you utilize it, and also why kind of mainstream economics has kind of been blind to it really as well.
I mean, that is really interesting. And, it's a kind of a tricky thing because I'm a man sat here saying it. And the idea is very much, and in the book, I do pay due attention to the roots of those ideas. And that concept of the invisible heart is actually due to a social feminist economist called Nancy Folber. And it's a very good metaphor for us. We talk all the time as economists about the invisible hand, the wonder of the market, the way that it creates social good out of private interest. Almost, and that's the point of the metaphor. It's almost by magic, invisible hand, that something happens that turns private self-interest into the social good. And in Adam Smith's day, when he was writing about that, of course, which was a very, very different culture, there was a sort of social logic behind it. It's not a silly idea. If you live in a transparent community where everyone knows what everyone's doing, you can't cheat your neighbors very easily, then people stay honest within that system. And that honesty, that trust, that bond between people actually is what creates the magic of the invisible hand. But the point that Nancy Folber and many other feminist economists have made is that it forgets the things that don't happen in the market. There's a wonderful book called Who Cooked Adam Smith's Dinner, which is kind of pointing out some of this, that actually, while we're celebrating the market and the magic of the market and the efficiency of the market and the dominance of growth, we're forgetting that there's a whole economy that sits around looking after people, nurturing people, keeping them well, feeding them properly, making sure they're clothed, getting them to school, looking after the parents when they're older, looking after people when they're disabled, an economy of care, a Cinderella economy. And so that metaphor became very, very important for me. But it also highlighted something else, which is, I suppose, what you're getting at in a way, which is that our economics has become gendered. It has become a sort of male patriarchal economics because it simply doesn't give value to that other economy. And it's taken a long time for people to really even come to a recognition that formal economics that we've inherited and created and developed has this deep sort of patriarchal structure, which is preventing us seeing what's blindingly obvious.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I will keep things moving on just to ensure we've got enough time for the audience questions. But I mean, yeah, it's a very interesting discussion already, interesting topics that we've mentioned so far. So, but yeah, I'll move on to the next point. One of the things that you talk about in the book as well was the Balmer's cost disease. So, um, again, I probably won't be able to explain that as well as you can. But you see that as kind of pointing towards solution, if you like, rather than creating a problem. I wondered if you could go into a little bit of detail about that for us.
Yeah, yeah. So this, I mean, again, this idea has its kind of roots in the way that I wrote about it in Prosperity Without Growth. I wrote about it, I should say, in a very different way, as you'll remember, in the Care Economy. I'm writing actually almost that chapter. It emerges as a kind of dream sequence, a meeting with Baumol to discuss his work. And to me, it's a very interesting piece of work. One of the things I was trying to do in the care economy is to understand why we systematically neglect this side of the economy, even though it is so foundational, so important to our lives. Why is it that we've learnt to neglect it? And one of the answers to that, of course, is because the economics we've had, which has been very powerful, has been a male dominated patriarchal economics, a structure of thinking and a structure of organization of our institutions that owes more to kind of masculinity in some narrow sense of that word than it does to a truly human voice across both genders. So that's definitely going on, but it takes that might sound a little bit, fluffy, like, well, we're talking at the level of values, and actually, yes, it's men who've been mostly involved in those processes, so it's not surprising. Does it really matter? But actually, it turns out that it does matter because, and this is where Baumol's cost disease comes in, is because capitalism selects in those activities which increase productivity and increase growth, and it selects out the kinds of activities like care and craft and creativity and connection and health. And it does so not just accidentally or not just because of some value orientation, but it does so systematically. And the reason is very, very obvious, and very, very insightful, that essentially all of those activities take time. They're things that you have to pay attention to the point of balance. You have to pay attention to the needs of the individual moment. Anyone who's engaged in any act of care knows that it's a kind of slow process, a process that demands our attention, and one, therefore, that it's very difficult to chase labor productivity out of. It's very difficult to increase labor productivity. It's very difficult to replace it with machines. It's very difficult to automatize it. Every care situation differs from moment to moment. And so you're constantly demanding time. Time in capitalism is money. And that was Baumol's point, is that there's a kind of, you end up with a kind of two-tier economy, an economy which you can automate and machine learn and give over to robots and AI and mass production. And it's very, very good at having lots and lots of things. You can mass produce loads of stuff that you can throw away as fast as possible. In the process, you can persuade people to buy more of it, and that will create profit and productivity. And yet, this other economy, so essential to us, just doesn't behave in the same way. It's very, very difficult. And you even hear people in the current debate, for example, about the NHS saying, the NHS has to improve its productivity. That's the problem. It's suffering from low productivity and it's got to improve it. We've got to have more efficiency. We've got to put efficiency into this system. It's got to be more productive. It's got to become an engine of growth. Now, there are some things you can do inside the health system, even things like using AI, which will improve the outcomes in terms of health. But there's a lot that you can do that will destroy the idea of health by displacing that activity of care with a misplaced idea about efficiency and productivity. And Baumol's point was really that in capitalism, under the incentives of capitalism, time is money, let's get rid of it out of the equation, let's increase productivity as fast as possible, that this slow economy, if I can call it that, is the one that is undermined continually and becomes increasingly un, unaffordable. The costs rise in relative terms. The incomes have to rise to match the rise in incomes in the fast sector, the fast productivity sector. And so it's constantly in a battle. And I mean, you said that I sort of solved that or looked at Beaumont's disease as a way of addressing the problem. It is first and foremost a way of understanding that the problem sits inside the structure of capitalism. And that's the level at which we have to address it.
Thank you. That was kind of going to go into my next point, if you like, really. I think, especially in the UK, we've been trying to find solutions to a productivity crisis over the last 20 years, without much success. We've already talked about the obsession with GDP, for instance. All of this does feel like it would need significant and substantial change, really, kind of probably beyond policy change. How do you see a path towards this kind of economy? What do you think needs to happen? What kind of conditions need to arise?
Yeah, yeah, I think it is. It probably you're probably right that it does need change beyond policy change. But one of the things that's happening in society is that the society is changing. And we're less patriarchal as a society. We're less accepting of that patriarchal structure. Social values have already changed and already tried to move away from it. There's something called the gender parity gap, which the World Economic Outlook looks at every year. And I mean, the statistics are very, very interesting because in some areas we're moving away from that gender disparity, and yet it's still going to take the world over a century to reach gender parity, according to those statistics. And we're actually, in some cases, we're moving further away from it rather than closer to gender parity. So there's still lots and lots of work to be done, but there's also a sense in which actually that work is not going to be done without policy. In some areas of our lives, our social values have moved on, but our institutions are still stuck in the past. And those institutional structures, the rules for those institutional structures are really set by policy, set by government, set by legislation, as much as they are by our social values. So there is a very, very distinct role for policy here. And, if you take that example that I used before, it's about the regulation of big food. It's about the outlawing of some kind of practices. It's about preventive medicine rather than allowing pharmaceutical intervention to be the basis of mass medicalization because we're eating the wrong stuff, which is produced in the wrong way. And by the way, it's also contributing massively to climate change. It's about recognizing actually and going, and it's an argument that should and could go directly into Treasury. You're creating a false economy. Yes, there's a productivity puzzle. Yes, we don't know why we can't get this growth that we are so fixated on creating year after year. But in the meantime, our pursuit of that ideal is beginning to destroy the fabric of society in all sorts of ways. Our health, our mental health, our social cohesion, the way that we work, the way that enterprises function, and all the ways that we measure things wrong. And so it's absolutely critical that we get a handle on this false economy and we begin to put in place these measures. And they start from something very simple. If health is our biggest asset, then care should be our most important investment. And if you treat care as an investment, actually, it sits differently in your fiscal rules. You account for it differently over time. It becomes something that you can fund and finance in very distinct ways that you don't when you think of care as just something either that happens outside the market or that's the last thing you think of once you've got growth. Put health first, put care first. You begin to think of that idea, that core idea, care as an investment in our most precious asset, which is our health.
Well, thank you. At this point, I would just like to invite any questions to come in through the Q&A section. Just type your questions in there, and I'll be able to relay and deliver those, and we can discuss those as they come in. But just as any kind of more questions are coming in, I did want to kind of briefly talk about kind of how some of these ideas have been implemented in the real world. And I think we had Jacinda Ardern's government have a well-being budget a few years ago. And I think that was scrapped relatively recently last year.
Mm.
Is kind of is that a particular challenge to the theory? Is what how would you describe or kind of evaluate when some of these ideas have tried to be implemented?
Yeah, I think that scrapping last year was actually, as it turns out, I know and worked with at one point the Prime Minister of New Zealand, whose government has just scrapped that. So I'm kind of, I feel as though I should go to him and ask him, what do you think you're doing? Because it was a point in time at which a government was doing something different. It was saying actually these other things matter, that well-being matters, and that we make our decisions and our funding allocations on the basis of a set of well-being indicators, not just growth, growth, growth. And so it was a very forward-looking policy. And it is the sort of thing that we need to put back in place. It is the sort of thing that makes sense to, a framework that systematically measures different aspects of health, different aspects of well-being, different aspects of planetary well-being, the damage that we're creating to the planet, so that we can live within the limits of this one finite planet that we have that looks like it's our best chance of a livable environment for some time to come. And if you're not looking at that, you're kind of apt to go badly astray, I think.
Thank you. Okay, let's have a look at some of the questions that have come in from the audience. And now, our first one here is, what is the role of business in a care economy?
I think that's a really good question. Um, I think there are various ways to answer it. I mean, certainly, if you're thinking about care in a narrow sense, then employment policy and indeed, labor policy generally, what are your provisions for your workers? Are they actually allowed or able to care for themselves? Do you have proper parental leave, for example? Are there proper disability benefits? Are you contributing in some way to the well-being of your employees? Those are critical questions for sure. But there's another direction to look as well, which is, if you're an enterprise, what is your product? What is it that you're bringing to society? And if you're not thinking about that question, then it's probably because what you're doing is essentially maximizing profit. And the lesson from Baumol's hypothesis, Baumol's cost disease, is that when you just focus on maximizing profit, that's when these things go missing. These aspects of the value of the service that the enterprise provides to society. And actually, it's a very interesting way to think about it. Instead of an enterprise being a kind of profit maximizing thing that mass produces as many products as possible to sell as fast as possible and make them fall apart as fast as possible, actually, an enterprise is about providing a service to society, to humanity. And to think of that, to ask that question as business is a very powerful way of thinking about what is that service? Second, how am I providing that service? Third, how could I better provide that service? And where do those dimensions of the health of society, the health of the product, the health of my employees translate into my investments as a business in relation to caring for those outcomes? And I think that's it's something that happens both at at the level of thinking about your marketing and your communications for sure, but it also has to happen at the level of thinking about your purpose as a business, adding purpose to profit as the foundation for a successful business.
Yeah. You're right. You're right. It is a powerful question to ask. It's almost a shame that it's such a powerful question to ask. If that makes sense, it feels like it should be something that is kind of intrinsic in the operation of these companies. But interesting. Thank you. Um, okay. Up here we've got what kind of reactions, and again, I think this is something that we often get whenever we have any discussions around kind of climate change or anything related to that. What kind of reactions have you had with these ideas from people in economies or countries that are not yet wealthy enough for them to discuss them?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question too. I mean, when I wrote Prosperity Without Growth, as I said, it was written for the UK government, one of the G7 economies, one of the richest economies in the world, the first developed economy, so-called developed economy, an economy that set the vanguard of capitalism, the crucible of capitalism in motion. And so I was not specifically writing for developing countries. I was not writing for the South. I was writing for a kind of audience very much in the North. And I was not expecting to have a reaction from countries that were at least outside the G7. Prosperity Without Growth has been published in over 20 languages. And some of those have been really, very surprising places. They're China, Russia, Latvia, but also, places in conversations that I've had in Malaysia and South Africa and Latin America. And I have to say, I was in the beginning, I was a little bit uncomfortable about that. The last thing anyone needs is another Anglo-centric economic model being exported to the rest of the world, to be perfectly honest. And I certainly didn't want to be an ambassador for that. But what I found was that actually, there was a lot of appetite for those ideas, in part because some of them really resonate with ideas that belong to indigenous cultures that predate capitalism by a very long time, and in which some social values actually are very supportive of this kind of change. And Latin America is very interesting because Latin America sits in a kind of sweet spot where all the health indicators are better, if anything, than they are in the Western economies. And yet the income per capita is a fraction of what it is in Western economies. So they're doing something right. They have something there that is already in the direction of prosperity as health. And therefore they're places that we can learn from as much as export our ideas to.
And I guess just briefly, have you seen kind of support for the ideas that you've kind of suggested since your first book? Have you seen support for those sorts of ideas change over time at all, or
I mean, it's always
most?
come, it comes and goes, this conversation. It's really, really interesting. I mean, as I say, the first reaction from the government that I reported to in 2009 was not very positive, but there was this enormous groundswell following that and the building up of a conversation around well-being, around sufficiency, around degrowth, around post-growth economics. It began to be, and I'm not saying I started it single-handed. I was a part of something which grew over that period of time and has been taken forward by lots of other people. And it was for a time a really important part of the conversation. I would say in the last probably 2 to 3 years, that has taken a step backwards, and that there's less inclination in so many places to question that. There was a sort of a highlight actually in 2023 when the European Parliament held a big Beyond Growth conference, and it was massive. It was a massive turnaround for EU policy. It brought thousands of people, quite a lot of young people, into economics and into Parliament for the first time. And it began to speak very, very differently about the kind of economy that we want. And yet, on the back of that, not enough has happened, I would say. And there's been a sort of a sliding away in the last couple of years, much more into a let's just focus on growth at all. And the demise of the wellbeing budget in New Zealand is a case in point. Let's just forget that nice stuff and focus on the really important things of, growth, 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 without a real recognition that, that any of these dynamics, that the dynamics can become poisonous even to society when you just focus on that. And at best, they can become ineffective in an environment in which the growth that you're trying desperately to get just isn't there anymore.
Thank you. The next question here, I always like when we get these sorts of questions. But what suggestions do you have for someone that's looking to study at master's and doctorate level around the sort of work that you're engaged in?
Yeah, that's another of those questions that came at me when I was talking about prosperity without growth back in the day. It was extraordinary that the audience was it was a very wide age range, but there were a lot of young people. I can remember audiences when I was at COP15 in Copenhagen in 2009. There would be people sitting on the stage and on the steps of the auditorium, and they would predominantly be economic students, and they would come up to me afterwards and they say, where can I get this kind of economics? And actually around about that time the rethinking economics movement was born, and the students occupy movement was born, and the kind of the demand for a different kind of economics was really, really began to kick off at that point. And I think some of that has stayed. There is now, there's much more now than there was in terms of students who wanting to look at this kind of thing. I think the field of ecological economics generally is a place which has always been open to that. So schools that are teaching ecological economics rather than mainstream or neoclassical or conventional economics, there's the whole phenomenon really of donut economics, which was, Kate Rayworth's real principle there was that economic students are just not getting an economics that's fit for purpose in the real world. So we have to begin to think differently. So well-being economics, ecological economics, donut economics, post-growth economics, these are the kinds of places I think to look for at least some a different kind of economics to what the main schools of economics have been teaching for probably too long.
Thank you. And moving on to the next one, then, in the age of think tanks, they say, how do you think this can strategically, how would you strategically channel these ideas towards any political movements? This person has suggested the Greens. I wonder what you make of their recent rise and if that could be a kind of avenue for some of these ideas. And they ask whether it would be beneficial to set up a new think tank, partly because these issues aren't supported by corporate interests.
Yeah, I mean, I've worked most of my life actually from very early on with think tanks, with NGOs, with activist movements, with Friends of the Earth, with Greenpeace, with the New Economics Foundation. And the New Economics Foundation is a very, very good example for anyone who's interested in this because it was formed out of something called the Other Economic Summit back in the 1970s, I think it was, a long, long time ago, when we had these kind of global economic summits with all the big leaders. And then there was a kind of a social movement created out of the idea, let's have an other economic summit to talk about all the things that this summit is actually missing that we're living on a finite planet, missing that there's huge inequality. And so the New Economics Foundation, which was built out of that, put really sustainability back into economics, put fairness back into economics, and is still doing a lot of very, very interesting work. And is a is a kind of is an essential partner to anybody who in academia or in business or in policy who who is trying to address these issues. The Wellbeing Economy Alliance is another such organization, the beginnings of a movement. The Green Party, as the question is asking, yes, I've always been a kind of supporter of the idea that the Green Party has some very different things to say. So it's fascinating to see Zach Belansky emerging as a kind of populist Green. We'll see kind of where that goes. And it's got to, in some sense, I think the challenge is a really interesting one. As an academic, you tend to think, well, I need to, prove my point. I have to write my papers. I've got to publish in recognized journals. They've got to be five-star journals. That's the only way my career is going to progress anyway. So that's my output. But actually, as soon as you look outside that, the places you've got to operate go from being involved in policy. So, for example, my centre was the secretariat for an all-party parliamentary group for 7 or 8 years, I think it was, around the limits to growth, around post-growth economics. So you've got to, find the ways to engage the politicians in. We also had a kind of a business link through a group called the Aldersgate Group, which has for some time been essentially a business-led organization to create pro-climate, pro-environmental policy in partnership with government. So the government actually listens to the Aldersgate Group, and they were involved in CUSP for again 6 or 7 years. And indeed, so it's policy, it's business, it's academia, but it's also an NGO activist community it's working with. And one of the fascinating things for me about all this is actually just sometimes going to local groups, local community groups who are doing fantastic stuff at the local level on the ground. Pulling that all together at this point in time, it's a really interesting question. Is there a scope for something like momentum? The movement that almost brought Jeremy Corbyn to power in 2000. Actually, didn't even get close, but it looked at one moment as though it was a set of people, quite a lot of young people, saying we need something different. We need a different kind of politics, and in a sense, I think that's the energy that Zach Polanski is trying to tap and move into. And for anyone who's kind of working in this area, I would say, you have to sort of be able to look around all of those areas, NGO, community, business, policy. Yes, academic stuff matters because we do need the foundations of an economics that works in a post-growth environment. We really need that. It just doesn't exist outside of a few small centers and research groups who are beginning to ask those questions. It's got to be robust. We can't just create the future by wishful thinking. But on the other hand, we do have to have a vision for that future, and that vision involves a lot of people. So it's a kind of, sweep the arena. And yes, there is a need, but there are also lots of different places where you can act within that arena.
Mm. Yeah, we've got quite a few questions that kind of linked around the idea of how these ideas are brought about and kind of, I guess, made mainstream, if you like. One of them asks about the role of civil disobedience, and whether that has a role. Another one here asks about the role of business schools in the care economy as well. I wonder if you have any
Yeah.
comments on either of those two.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, I wrote about civil disobedience quite explicitly in Post-Growth: Life After Capitalism, in the middle one of the trilogy, and why it matters. It matters that politicians have to be held to account, and it's actually the concept of civil disobedience goes right back to John Locke. It's not some new thing that Extinction Rebellion invented, or that that the Occupy movement invented. It's actually a principle of our political economy that ultimately it is people who give government its mandate. And in circumstances under which government is not seen as fulfilling that mandate, civil disobedience is an accepted part of that political philosophy. And so obviously it matters what form that civil disobedience takes, but it's really interesting that it has always been a cornerstone of democracy. And so it really does matter to protect it and to think of it as a meaningful part of democratic representation. Um, what was the second one, David? The
The role of business schools.
business schools. Yeah, again, fascinating. Business schools are, I mean, they're sort of the bastions of translating economics into business, and organization and management skills into business as well. So if they are not teaching these ideas or open to these ideas, then the economics profession is not going to change. The way that economics is taught to people who are setting out in business is not going to change. The infrastructure of business is not going to change. The organization of business is not going to change. There's not going to be an appetite for change. So business schools are again one of those things that sit right at the kind of fulcrum of change in a way. And I've worked with business schools. I worked with business schools quite early on in Prosperity Without Growth. I've had, I think, one engagement with a business school in France since The Care Economy was published. It was only published a few months ago. And it was again, it reminded me of those early days when I was talking about prosperity without growth, because there were people sitting on the steps and sitting on the of the auditorium and coming up to me afterwards, where can I get this? Where can I get more of this? How can I develop this? And some of the most fascinating conversations I had in a kind of 3 day road tour recently around France were from very, very bright business school students. And so I know that there is an appetite amongst the students, and I think it's about creating, business school curricula that are encouraging that inquisitiveness and that desire for change that students are now bringing into business schools.
Thank you. Another comment here picks up on the idea of inequality. And I guess I wondered the extent to which kind of you believe your ideas are linked in with ideas relating to inequality. And this person goes on to ask how inequality could be tackled through systems change, sorry.
Yeah.
And if you don't think that's a viable option, what do you think we can do about it?
Yeah, it is a really, really important question. I mean, the thing about growth, the thing for a politician that is so attractive about growth is that you don't have to think about redistribution. You don't have to think about distributing the resources that we have, the income, the materials, the opportunities, because as long as the pie is growing, there's more for everyone. As soon as that pie stops growing, if you are not thinking about distribution, if you're not thinking about inequality, you are beginning to, really, I would say, to undermine the social fabric of society, because you're creating inequality in all sorts of ways, not just income inequality, but food inequality, health inequality, mental health inequality. And those things are happening because when the pie is not continually expanding, you cannot afford to let one part of society become richer and richer, because the inevitable result of that is another part of society becomes poorer. So you have to be thinking about inequality in some ways. It's almost like the most important first order policy prescription that has to come out of a post-growth economics is if you're not expanding the pie, you have to be thinking about the distribution of it because there cannot be more for the rich without there being less for the poor. And the reality is, at the moment, our pie is really not expanding very much. Our growth rates are very, very low. Our labor productivity growth rates are even lower. And that means essentially that anything which is gained at the top of society is being lost by the bottom of society. And so, even in a society that calls itself a growth society, you absolutely have to keep your eye on that. And if you're not doing that, and there was a wonderful book published around the same time actually as Prosperity Without Growth, called The Spirit Level by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett. And they make a really important point that the more that inequality in society doesn't just affect the poorest in society, it affects the fabric of society, and that affects everybody. So it's absolutely critical, and it's thinking about that in policy. If you were putting it first in policy, and the Labour government really should be doing that, you would be doing the things that looked at distribution and redistribution. And you would look at that not just in terms of income, but you would look at it in terms of wealth, in terms of property, in terms of access, in terms of health, as I said before. And this has to be a part of your currency, the sort of thing that you could be measuring if you had a well-being budget. And that is one of the most important things to measure in a well-being budget. So yeah, that matters.
I guess I'll go straight to this question there because that's directly linked with what you just mentioned. Do you have any hope that this government, especially Rachel Reeves, as we know, she's got her budget tomorrow, especially how do you think she has any understanding of the care economy and embodies any of your principles?
Um, well, I listened to her speech in the Labour Party conference. Um, I've listened to her announcement, the sort of pre-budget announcement she did at 8 o'clock in the morning some time ago. I listened to the way that she speaks, and she speaks in two different voices, really. One for me is a voice that could or should be amenable to the arguments about the care economy. Because it is, there are values in the Labour Party, and those values come from concerns for inequality. They come from a concern for working people. They come from a concern for people's welfare, their well-being, their health, and therefore they should be. It should really be, and you hear that. You can hear that in her voice, in her commitment, in her language, and yet there's another part of Rachel Reeves, which is it feels like I'm a bureaucrat with a safe pair of hands, and I've got to prove that these hands are safe, and I've got to meet my own fiscal rules because I said I was going to meet my fiscal rules, and she's boxed into an impossible situation now, largely as a result of fiscal rules that didn't need to be there, but were only there to kind of prove their credentials of this new government as being a safe pair of hands. And it must be torture. I mean, I must say that if you have these two things, if you had this kind of vision actually of something which could be different, and you tie yourself down in so many ways, and then get everything wrong by making, the wrong decision about national insurance contributions, the wrong decision about inheritance tax, the wrong decision about welfare, you're in a kind of nightmare where you're trying to constantly catch up to all these wrong decisions while still staying in your box. She reminds me a little bit of someone who is just too good at school and who doesn't ever want to break any kind of rules. And she's even going to set herself some rules so that she can't break them. And then she can't figure out why it's an impossible mess that she can't solve. I mean, my hope is that she can solve it because I do think there are values there that matter, but they're not being allowed to come through as it stands. Maybe we'll all be surprised on Wednesday.
Yeah, so I mean, I don't envy her personally.
Yeah, right.
Just very, very briefly, as we're coming right to the end, just one question here. I think it's relatively perceptive. They say that the environment is obviously inextricably linked with health. Is it possible to maximize both, or are there situations where there might be a trade-off between them?
Yeah, I think in the short term there might be places where there's a trade-off. if you don't have good housing stock, for example, and you need to build houses, where are you going to build that? You're probably going to build it on some land, and therefore that land is no longer a green space that is available for people. I mean, you can do a lot better in terms of planning than we're actually doing, but it might be in the short term, there's a kind of a trade-off. In the long term, I don't think there is a trade-off. I just don't think that unless we can protect the land, unless we can protect the environment, unless we can protect the climate, unless we can protect the soil which grows our food, on which we depend to thrive and survive, unless we can protect those things, there's no sense that we can protect health into the long term. And so it's a complex question, particularly because there's a difference between that sort of short-term trade-off and the long-term outcome. But the long-term outcome, planetary health and human health, are so closely aligned that they really have to go together, and that means at least putting planetary health up there with human health as a part of our guidelines, our guide rails, I suppose you could call them. The way in which we have to steer our economy, the way we have to steer our policy. It has these two kind of guardrails, planetary health and human health, and they both have to guide the way that we create policy and the way that we organize the economy.
Thank you very much. I think that's a particularly apt note to end on. So, Tim, thank you very, very much for your time. And it's a very intellectually stimulating conversation. And it's kind of really made the issue kind of quite illuminating. And I hope that the audience, sorry, go on to grab a copy of the book and read the fine details that you present in it.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thank you, David. And I would say that our conversation inevitably has been sort of quite intellectual, going through the concepts. The book is, and one of the reasons why I hope people will read the book is because it is really written as a kind of adventure, and in particular for people who whether they like economics or not, don't always just read economic textbooks. It's a very different kind of book, and I hope that appeals to people. And certainly the reactions I've had from quite a broad range of people. In particular, I think the audience that I feel particularly pleased to have reached a little bit is health professionals, people actually working in health, understand these arguments quite well. But actually, ordinary people outside that, just a lay audience saying, I never really pick up a book about the economy, but I really enjoyed it, and that's a fantastic accolade. It's something that I feel very proud of the book for being able to achieve. Here's a what it looks like. And my job, I feel, before I get on to the next in the non-trilogy, whatever it is when you've produced four of them, my job is to be a sort of ambassador for the book, because it did sort of emerge in a very strange way. It wasn't a case of just sitting down and writing all the academic arguments. It was very much a sense to me of listening to how the book wanted to tell its story. So I'm very grateful to have written it.
Well, I mean, we've been glad to have you on, and to be honest, it's particularly because part of the work that we do here at the ELC is to try to highlight economic conversations in a way that is accessible to the general public, whether they're interested in economics or whether they're not really. But yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks, David.
No worries at all. And it's sincere thank you to everybody else that has joined us this evening. Your attendance and comments and questions have been wonderful and have really facilitated a really good discussion. So thank you. Um, Again, just finally, thank you very much to Jim Jackson and to everybody else for joining us. And yeah, wish you a lovely, wonderful evening, even though we've run a little bit late. My apologies.
Thank you.